Hello guys. So today what we're going to talk about for a little bit is how to turn outlines into paragraphs. And I wish I could give you a hard and fast rule, but every paper is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to show you guys what I do when I go through my outline and try to figure out how to put it into paragraphs. But before we do, we have to talk a little bit about the style of writing that we're going to be using. I'm not going to be incredibly strict on this. This is a 10 point out of 100 for your assignment. But I do want you guys to look at formal writing. And with this, formal writing does mean that you are avoiding second and first person pronouns. So the you, the we, the our, all of those sort of things. Except, of course, in quotes, like Ponyboy is saying it, sure, just say we and our. But if you are saying it, don't say like we see this in. Say the reader. Always replace that with the reader sees this in. And also see where you can switch around some of those nouns and verbs to use like a third person pronoun instead, or say like Hinton or author shows us or shows readers this in. So the next thing is avoid contractions. Don't use them. Of course, using a contraction there. Yes, I love irony. And the last thing is try to avoid using any sort of vague language. So using terms like something isn't right is not all that informative, or this is somewhat unfortunate. Avoid the somewhat, just say this is unfortunate. And this includes things like slang too. We're going to try to stay away from it. Last but not least, I do want you guys to use present tense in this, so don't be using past tense like he yelled at her. We always treat stories as if they are happening when you write about them. So you would say like Ponyboy is or Johnny is. Even though we know that Johnny dies and we know that he died at a certain point, you'll say, like he asks Ponyboy something. He dies at the end. Don't use past tense. And I would like to just point out that for some people, it's really hard to do this in the first draft. Like you tend to really write very informally. Some people enjoy doing a first draft that is super informal, and that is totally fine. The only thing is, if you are that sort of person, make sure that you change it. You go back, find the yous, find the we's, find the i's, take out the contractions, switch it to present tense. Do all of that before you turn it in, okay? So it's nice if you can do it in the first draft because then you have less work later. But if you're going to want to focus on just getting the point across first, that's totally fine. You can fix it before the final paper. Now, what we're going to look at is how much do you put in a paragraph? Because this is a question I get a lot. And unfortunately, the answer is enough. But there are some things that can help you along with this. And the first is your thesis. Your thesis is your guiding light throughout this entire paper. It's showing you really what you are going to need in a paper because you are just trying to put in everything that you need to get across in order for people to completely agree with your thesis. So this is my thesis, of course, that though Family Boy's family is not determined only by blood, the outsiders show that true families are made up of people who are willing to support and sacrifice for one another. So again, there are a couple different versions of that thesis. This is just the one I'm going with for this paper. So you're going to ask yourself, what small ideas do I need to get across so that people agree with my thesis? And I tend to break this down according to my outline. So I use about 1 point per paragraph. And I'm not talking main points here, okay? So if you look at one, you can see that there are 3 smaller points. I talk about Johnny's abusive parents, Derry's absent parents, and then Dally's absent parents, and then Soda, Derry, and Ponyboy who lost their parents. Each one of those would probably be its own paragraph. The first one is going to establish that blood relatives might not be family because they're abusive, and I'm going to show how Johnny's family is not really family. And for Soda, Dairy, and Ponyboy, I might be making the point that, their parents are not there, so they can't have them as their normal family. And that's where they've lost the blood relations for family, at least in terms of parents. And then I might get to Deli's absent parents and go, I kind of already made the point that parents are absent. So maybe I can cut this. And that's totally fine. If you're like, wait, I already made this point, and you don't think it needs more proof, cut it out. The paper does not need to be forever long. So I might cut that out and just use A and B in my actual paper. Now you get down to 3 and you're like, oh, but look at 3B. That thing is huge. There's no way I can put that all in a paragraph. Well, that's okay. What you can do is kind of split it up into smaller things if you think that you're making more than one point, or use lists a little bit more. So for instance, 3B says that we're trying to make the point in our thesis that true family has support and sacrifice, right? That's what determines what a family really is. And for Dally, we can see these things where he gives up his jacket, he helps even when he has a little, he helps Johnny and Ponyboy at the fire even though he doesn't want to help the kids. He wants to protect Johnny and he can't cope with the loss of Johnny. Now what I'm going to kind of do is maybe split that into 2 paragraphs. One, I can talk about what he maybe gives up physically, the sacrifice element. One, I can talk about what he does to support, or maybe I can talk about emotionally what he does for family. So I could group it according to, Dally shows that he is family, even though he doesn't seem like family, because he's willing to give up what little he has to help others. He gives up his jacket. He gives them a gun and gets them out of the city. And he is always there to protect Johnny physically. So I'll support each of those little ones inside that paragraph, giving those pieces of example and pieces of examples to support each one, and then explaining it a little bit. And then I'll do a second paragraph, new paragraph, where I'll say, Johnny or Dally also shows his family because he truly loves them. And in this one, I can talk about how he loves them enough to change his decision. So, like he wasn't going to help in the fire, but because Johnny and Pony were there, he risked his life. Like that's love. He wouldn't help a stranger. He showed that. But he would help them. So that shows his love. And also in that same paragraph, I might also say we can see this extreme love when he can't cope with the loss of Johnny. And I might pull a quote or 2. Now, if that paragraph is starting to get long, I might split it out according to examples. But you got to watch that you are staying as focused as possible. Maybe I find that I don't need all of those subpoints and I cut out a few so I can focus better on my strongest examples and my strongest points. It is totally fine to cut a lot of things out of your essay. And you might notice that you're going to end up with a fairly long paper. Each one of those points, 1, 2, and 3, will be somewhere between 1 and 3 paragraphs long. In fact, number 3 will probably be 5 paragraphs long looking at it, just at a glance. And that might need to get adjusted as you're going through your paper. But that is not by any means unreasonable. So I want you guys to ask yourself, what ideas do I need to get across so that people agree with my thesis? And generally, we try to keep towards 1 key piece of evidence, like a really impactful quote, or 3 smaller pieces of evidence. Once you get past that, it gets hard to balance them all. Okay, you might use 1 key piece with like 1 or 2 little sub pieces that'll help you support it, but that's usually the max you'll want in a paragraph, because otherwise what it becomes is a list of facts rather than an actual paragraph. And you need to be trying to convince people. Lists of facts need to be explained, otherwise they feel kind of pointless. So let's look at what goes into a good paragraph. Now this is going to be a bit of a review. But the first thing you need in a solid paragraph, and I'm going to look for these when I grade, is you need a topic sentence. A topic sentence is basically a thesis sentence. We've been over this before. It's the sentence that establishes the main topic of the paragraph, not of the paper, but of the paragraph. Once you have that, you're going to introduce your evidence. So you're going to transition towards how you're going to make this point. You can use things like this is shown when, or according to Ponyboy, or on page blank, or Soda does not agree with this statement when, and actually then you're setting yourself up for bringing in the true evidence, which is the next thing that you need in a good paragraph. And that actual evidence could be things like quotes. It could be those pieces like events summarized. And you just need to make sure that you include the page number at the end. You can do that right after you list the event or the quote. It just goes in parentheses, like that 58 there, with the period after. So you put it inside the same sentence that the evidence is in, and the period goes after. We'll talk about that a little bit more on Thursday. Last but not least, and guys, this one is so important. We haven't stressed it a lot this year. This is what I'm really going to look that you grow in on this paper. And that is that you have to finish your paragraph by tying everything that you've shown to a final conclusion, just like really within the larger point. So what I'm saying is, don't leave your reader hanging. Tell them, what does this evidence that you've shown, what does that actually show you? Like, why is this in here? Why did you show them this quote? Because if you just leave a quote and then move on to the next paragraph, the person's like, great, you can read a book at me. No, give them a conclusion. Don't make them do the work. You're the author. Be clear and specific and tie it towards that main thesis statement. It doesn't need to have everything in the thesis statement, but maybe one of the points. So let's look at an example of this. So here's my outline again, and I'm just going to start with my first paragraph. And I have my thesis to guide me. Now, in this thesis, the only part I'm working on is that people might not have blood relatives for family. So here's what my paragraph turned out to be. I want to establish that Johnny's abusive parents are not family. So I start with a topic sentence. Despite the role blood relatives are supposed to serve as loving family members, not all of them do so. Because my point, remember, is that his abusive parents are not really family. So I start with the broad point. Johnny's biological parents are an example of this. And again, I'm focusing on it slightly more. So blood relatives, not family. And in this specific instance, for Johnny, his biological parents are an example of this. And here's where I'm starting my evidence. His introduction on page 12 tells readers that, quote, his father was always beating him up and his mother ignored him, except when she was hacked off at something. And then you could hear her yelling at him to clear to our house, period. Now notice that this had the page number before the quote. That's totally fine. If, by the way, you had done this without on page whatever, you could just put it in parentheses outside the quotation marks. All through the story, this, and I'd probably actually modify it to include, this abuse continues. Johnny expresses a desire to be loved. I put parentheses there because that's where I'd add the page number. Asks Dally if they care, page number, and even dies without them visiting. This final dismissal of him shows that they were never really family. Not only did they not support him, they could not take the time and affection to be there for him in his moment of greatest need. And here's where I'd add that final conclusion, connect it back. What is our overall point? Our point is that families will never abandon people truly. And they did. So they're not his. So that could be my final sentence there. I get really, really close to it, but I haven't quite stated it. So I'd add that final sentence for a concluding sentence here. And I'd move on to my next one about Soda, Dairy, and Ponyboy. Maybe doing a transition here by saying, well, some blood relatives aren't family because they don't care. Others are just absent for things that are outside of their control. And then I talk about Soda, Dairy, and Ponyboy. Notice I start with my main point. I go into the evidence, like their parents are dead. And I talk maybe about how the parents had wanted to be there, and it just couldn't be. And that would be the end of my second paragraph, and I could move to my families can be chosen. So that is how I would format my paper, and that is the basics of turning it into paragraphs. Treat each paragraph almost like a mini paper. Take your time with them. By tomorrow, I want you to have done at least 2 paragraphs. So at least 2 paragraphs. And submit those 2 paragraphs on Classrooms. I can take a look at them and make sure that you're on the right track. I won't necessarily be able to give you guys all feedback all at once. It's a lot to go through. But I will try to be glancing over them in the next few days so that you can get some feedback as we go. Final paper is due end of the day on Friday. Have at it, guys.